Mark said send it, so we are sending it. And today we're going to be talking about, I don't know what exactly to properly call this. Is it's reloading 201, 102? I don't know if I took any
I guess this is probably the 200 level.
I don't know if I took any 200 level classes in college, so I don't.
You just started with the 4s.
Right. We're going to be probably talking a lot about,
this could
things.
be dangerous in reloading. That. You might not exist much longer.
It's likely we could be talking about some very precise things, so I've laid out a few things for inspiration here on the table. We have a big hammer, vice grips, and a screwdriver.
Phillips screwdriver, might we add?
Phillips is good.
It's better.
Lefty tighty.
More surface area. With us here, we've got Mark and myself, Jimmy here. We've got Ryan Muckenhern. He was on the last Reloading podcast. Now, on the last one, we had Tom Leatherberry and Jimmy Jordan here. But on this one, we've brought in a couple of new guests. Scott Parks here. He's been on a few podcasts before, so you guys know him. And then also Paul Ness, who's been on a number before, and you know him as well. Now, these guys, like I said, will probably venture. I don't know. I was talking with Ryan just briefly before we were on this. I think a lot of this is probably going to wind up diving into some of the things revolving around a little bit more precise, like longer range shooting or tuning a load to be more precise, more so than like mass production of reloading ammunition. Would you say?
Yeah, like the application sciences of reloading, like why you would do a particular step or pick a particular projectile or a particular cartridge and load for it.
Yeah, because like, is there a lot, and I don't want to downplay this by any means, but is there a lot of like 200 level stuff for a dude who's just in his basement just pumping out 9mm?
Well, there can be. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, yes, I think there absolutely can be. I think this is for the guy or gal who's you've reloaded ammunition for a while, but now you're like seeking a very particular purpose, like you're loading for. A match you're going to shoot, or you're loading for a game animal you're going to hunt, possibly with a cartridge that may be on the outskirts of appropriate, and we're going to match a better designed bullet for it, or something like that.
Right. Now, so again, last time, just to recap, if you haven't listened to 101 yet on reloading, we talked about all this terminology, so you might hear stuff in here that doesn't make sense at first. You can go back there, here's some terminology, also just kind of why reloading, the process of the actual reloading we kind of touched on a little bit. Tom and Jimmy, don't do some of the stuff like annealing or neck turning, stuff like that. We might get into that here. And then a little bit into the actual shooting portion and tuning your load. I think we'll get into a lot of that here. So, Scott, could you give the listeners a little brief history on some of your reloading that you do? Because
I think no question, Scott is the reigning expert here in this group, so we're all ears.
Some pretty high level stuff. Love to hear about that, and then questions will surely ensue.
Sure. I think like anybody, I started out, just playing with it, hoping not to blow myself up. And
step one.
That sounds very familiar. Yeah.
And I became very intrigued with it. It's if you're the type of person that likes tinkering with stuff, then I would highly suggest reloading. Mm-hmm. You can make it as complicated or as simple as you would like, honestly. I have been at both ends of that spectrum. I probably fall right in the middle of that area now. That's not to say that my reloading's mediocre. It's just that I've done enough over the years to realize that there's a lot of little extra stuff that's not necessarily necessary.
You've kind of prioritized the major things.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Because typically I find myself when I'm reloading for a match, it's usually the night before I'm leaving, 2 hours before I need to head to the airport. So my priority is to load the most precise ammo I can as quickly as I can.
Okay.
So I actually load my precision rifle ammo on a progressive press. Now, that's not to say I'm not sizing the brass on the progressive. I'm literally priming, charging, seating bullets.
Okay.
And now, I didn't just start doing that without really investigating it and seeing what my results were, right? Years ago, I decided to try it to see what happened, and just started comparing stuff like run out and concentricity compared to my single stage press, and I really didn't see a difference.
Is a progressive press for precision stuff generally kind of like a no-no a
think
little bit, just because it's kind of more of a mass production kind of
volume,
thing?
big numbers.
It can depend on the circle of people you're talking to as well.
Yeah.
So like when Scott first told me that, I had this assumption that Scott's reloading room looked much like some sort of NASA
laboratory.
Yeah. Right? Because the dude
More like a trailer park tornado zone.
That's a good quote. I had this preconceived notion of what Scotty's reloading room must look like, because he's unhappy when his gun shoots into the .3s. He's like, something's wrong, man. I don't know what's going on. It broke a quarter minute. And when he said that he loads precision ammo on a progressive, I thought he was kind of pulling my leg. I thought he was giving me a line here, and I'm like, it's a good one, Scott. Like, that's funny. But he's like, no, seriously, I have 2 Dillon 650 set up just to run bullet seeding and powder drop. And I'm like, what? And by golly, he does, and he makes some good ammo. But if you were to go to a bench rest competition, and I'm not going to speak to all bench rest shooters, but a few that I've talked to, if you told them that you load your match ammo on a progressive press,
They'd probably have a heart attack.
they would, yeah. and you'd likely be kicked out of the club and possibly ostracized in the community.
Blackball.
Yeah, correct.
Right.
Yeah. You'd go to the bar and they'd all sneer at you.
Now, would you say that a lot of that comes from, like, the bench rest guys, are they loading ammo differently than how you're doing it? Or I guess maybe not even just bench, but just people who have that mindset, are they maybe loading different kinds of ammo or loading ammo for different purposes than you might be, Scott?
I want to add or ask another question in tandem with that. Do they need less volume for what they're doing too?
I was
Right.
just
No
gonna
doubt.
ask the same
Yeah,
thing.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And-
So that's the thing. I can afford to have one bad round out of 200. Like, it's
Right.
probably, well, for one, for, shooting precision rifle matches, like, I'm really not going to know if it was the round or if it was me, right?
Right.
Whereas, bench rest guys, they definitely want to know every round is perfect. I can't tell you if I've ever made a bad round because, well, if I miss, I miss.
Right.
Generally, it's me, so I'm not worried about it.
Did you try asking the round?
After you shot it? Can you, like, what would constitute a bad round for you would be just maybe like your couple kernels off on your powder charge, or the bullet wasn't seated right, or?
Yeah, so it would be, only thing that would be, I guess, if I made just a horrible mistake and forgot to put powder in something, which obviously it's not going to fire. So that obviously tells you if there's something wrong or not in that situation.
True.
But yeah, typically it'll just be like, heavier neck tension. But that being said, you can eliminate those too. So if I am seating a bullet and I feel that it's got more neck tension on it, I mark it and I set it aside. And those rounds are used for stages with really big targets.
So you can just feel that, you said?
Absolutely.
Huh. Is that when you're just going down to the
Yep.
press handle? You kind of done it so
Yeah.
much, you've gotten a good feel for it.
I was going to say
Yeah,
that's
it doesn't take much. That doesn't take much. I mean, you pick up on that pretty quick.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm a novice, and I have definitely felt that
Okay.
All right.
a
Already.
time or two. So yeah, I agree with Scott. It's not that hard to pick up on that.
And you said, like, the sizing and stuff isn't done as much, isn't done on the progressive. You do that
I do
elsewhere.
that. Yeah.
So would that be what then makes it a tighter or?
No, there's a number of things I think that can cause some heavier neck tension. One could just be that particular piece of brass has a slightly thicker neck. And so when you're sizing it, it's getting sized a little more.
Oh, okay.
It could be that that piece of brass has been fired a little hotter than the other pieces of brass, so now it's work hardened a little more. That type of thing, in which case that would actually be a looser seat, so to speak, because it's not going to size as well.
Yeah, I suppose you could feel the opposite too, maybe. where-
Absolutely, yeah. Now, that being said, I typically don't worry about the ones that seat light.
Okay.
I haven't noticed that they really affect anything. To be honest with you, I haven't noticed that even the ones that seem to seat a little heavier but in my head, it's something I need to. It's a total mental thing. If you've got your load shooting good, it's gonna shoot good, unless you do something just. I don't even know what I could do.
Way off
honestly.
in outer space.
Just
Yeah.
super wrong.
Yeah. I mean, if I've got a load developed to where an extra thou neck tension is throwing me out of the node, well, I don't have a load developed in my mind.
Right.
I got some
lucky.
work to do.
Yeah. You got lucky and it was shooting good and you were on that threshold of
Right.
disaster.
And so I mean, and it's going to show up, right? So you just have to not do that.
Interesting.
Did we cover the node in the
I
last
was
one?
just going to ask you guys talk
we
about
did.
that.
Kind
Okay.
of briefly cover it, but that was something that I wanted to go in further depth on this kind of 201 style. Just in general, once you've actually begun to, well, I guess, okay. So for example, and I guess, Paul, you mentioned briefly that you're more of a, I guess at this point, a novice reloader, but you do know quite a bit about bullets and cartridges. You've been shooting for quite some time. So we went into Scott there a little bit more, but as far as, like Tom Weatherbury mentioned last time, and this I think was a great advice for somebody who is maybe more of a beginner 100 level style reloader, that he just consults the reloading manuals to start, right? So essentially he's loading something that isn't very much different than the factory loads. Now he's probably being a little bit more consistent. That's kind of what was his argument behind how much he's loading as far as powder goes and where the bullet's being seated. He can fine tune that a little bit more for the rifle that he's shooting. Is that pretty much how it works for you guys? I guess being like Scott or Paul and Ryan, maybe being a little bit maybe more on this advanced level and this precision shooting, and when you're really developing something, do you generally start out with just kind of the way the factory does it, or do you try something totally different right off the bat because you're more comfortable with it?
For me, I can tell you, believe it or not, I've actually never owned a reloading manual, ever. Now I have got the free Hodgdon reloading.
That's
Okay.
what I've done too.
And
Just a really basic.
And I've definitely have consulted with that over the years. Plus they put a new one out every year. I don't think anything ever changes in it, but except for when a new cartridge comes along.
New cartridges, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But after you've been doing it for a while, honestly, you kind of just know what where to start.
Yeah, when I started a little bit like Scott, I don't think I ever bought a big nice reloading manual, but I consulted a lot of different information. Obviously read a lot on the internet and shooting forums. Went through all the information that came along with the equipment I bought, the dies and the press and all that sort of thing. And so eventually you kind of have a pretty good idea of what you should and shouldn't be doing. And you can find obviously tons and tons and tons of information out there on the various long-range shooting forums.
Yeah.
That kind of go into specifics about reloading. And it was funny. What pushed me into it is I had been interested in it for a long time, but just kind of put it off, not having the time or the space to do it. And then finally, I got around. I wanted to buy a 338 Lapua, and I bought one. And I decided at that time that was going to be. I was going to teach myself to reload because of that cartridge, because it was very expensive to buy factory ammunition.
Yeah.
And I knew that, I did the math on it and I could reload those, I think, for it was $1.20 a piece, figuring a number of reloads on a piece of brass. So it was way cheaper than what factory ammo was. And I thought if I could at least match match factory ammo, which isn't that hard to do, I'd come out ahead of the game. And so eventually that pushed me into it, and I started trying to learn and read, and everything went really well. I ended up with a load for the rifle that I've got that I'm really happy with. It shoots well. It's very reasonably priced when you do the long term, figuring out how much you can get out of a piece of brass. But everybody's kind of got different reasons you probably get into it, and for me that was why I did.
So like, when you start on a new caliber like that 338, or maybe you've been loading one for a while and you switch to a different one, is it kind of like, do you kind of become, once you're more experienced with this, almost like a chef in some regards, where I do a lot of cooking and I've gotten to the point now where I don't touch the tablespoons and teaspoons. It's like just about that much salt, that much pepper, garlic, whatever. Is it kind of like that, or still? I mean, when you're cooking, you're not at risk of something blowing up in your face. So,
taking your head off.
Yeah, there's got to be some level, I'd imagine, of at least figuring out what the base is as far as,
You get a pretty adept understanding of like a cartridge class, right? So I shoot a lot of 308 and 30-06, if we'll call them that, cartridge class rounds, like 243, 260, 308, 25-06, 270, 280, 280 Ackley, 30-06, 338-06. They all fall kind of into that ballpark.
7mm08 isn't there, right?
It is. It's not one it's not one I have. I'm sorry, Jim. The 308 is just better. Yeah, so you get kind of a feel for it, but you still need to know. Like the powder charge is a very exacting thing, and so you still need to know on that. I think for guys like Scott, like if we pick a particular case type or case family and a particular bullet weight, I would bet that Scott would be able to give us a powder to start with his knowledge of burn rate and like pressure curve and things like that with relative bullet weight.
As long as it's something in the realm of being close to cartridges I know.
Right, not something like bizarre.
Yeah,
right.
like if you asked me for a 416 Rigby load, I'd be like, I don't know.
It's just you stuff the case full of cordite.
Like, let me Google it for you.
Yeah.
But like that kind of thing, like I've consulted Scott with that, or consulted with Scott on that before. Like, hey, this cartridge, this bullet weight, hey, try this powder. It's different than what your manual's saying. Here's why, and it works every time.
So why does that? Like Scott, what am I trying to say? Like clearly, when you go in your head and you think about that stuff, Ryan mentioned a few things like these pressure curves and stuff like that. There's a reason that a number you might spit out, or Paul or Ryan, whoever might spit out, is the number you spit out. It's not something you pulled out of thin air, and it's not probably, I'd imagine, just kind of like a gut feeling. There's a lot of knowledge behind that. So what's gotten you to that point? What have you had to understand in order to get yourself to where, okay, I kind of have a feeling where with this bullet weight, this diameter bullet, I don't even know what it is. Like things that I would list. What are those things that run through your head immediately about the characteristics of a cartridge that would lead you to find a starting point with it?
Need to know bullet weight, right? And then obviously the size of the cartridge itself. But I actually kind of start a little different than that. So if I pick a cartridge, or if somebody says, hey, I'm going to load for this cartridge, like there's a very few select powders that I will run that I trust.
In anything, pretty much?
In any rifle cartridge.
Any rifle cartridge, yeah.
And the reason being is because I know from experience that these particular powders do very well in pretty much all temperature environments. So I don't have to worry about getting, pressure spikes or losing a bunch of velocity and coming out of my node if it's super cold out.
Which is this is a huge thing too.
They can actually control that when they make the powder, how
Yeah. So like a side note, like bloop, right now, you're on your reloading bench, you cook up a load for whatever cartridge it is, and you take it out in June and you shoot a really fantastic group with it. And you're like, wow, there's my load. And you load up, 200 rounds. You're like, there's my lifetime supply. And you find that come November, December, when you're out hunting game with it, like it's acting completely different than it did in June. This is a good point, or good time to investigate what Scott's talking about, and that is like how temperature affects a given powder.
Well, I think that's a really important.
The powder is the primary thing it affects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
other stuff you don't really.
It's burn rate and how it behaves under pressure.
Huh.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that's a really cool point to bring up because that same person might be going, I know this load shoots absolutely perfect.
Yep.
So it must be the gun. It must be the optic. It must be, what is causing these, less than desirable accuracy symptoms.
Yep.
And it could be just the temperature change.
Yep.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
So is that then a characteristic of, I guess it is a characteristic of the powder that they make. I don't know if you know so much as to like what it is that they do differently, but you're looking for something that's more of a a stable, almost
Absolutely.
year round, for lack of a
Yeah.
better term.
Yeah.
And
thing.
the powder manufacturers will advertise that.
Oh, they will?
They'll
Okay.
go, it's an obvious benefit if something is a temperature stable powder. So they'll generally
Right.
make a pretty good. You'll be aware of it when you're looking at powders. That,
Yeah. So, like generally speaking, your temperature stable powders are going to be extruded powders. They're going to be single base. Your powders that'll give you more velocity, but won't be all that temperature stable. Generally, are going to be your ball powders and your double base powders.
And what's the difference between single and double base? My novice shows
The Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong here. I believe it's just
Between double and single base.
Yeah, it's the
Application process of a
but is it? What's that explosive that starts with an N?
nitrocellulose.
nitrocellulose.
Yeah. So nitro.
Yep.
Yeah, single base powders apparently don't have nitro, I guess. Something like that.
So it's a chemical.
So they add nitro
yeah.
to, that's what makes it a double base powder.
Oh, okay.
And you're seeing a lot of that stuff fade into obscurity very rapidly lately, and a lot of powders being updated. What I think is interesting is I have owned a lot of reloading manuals because, like, that was just, for me at a time, it was just like a fascinating thing to just page through them and look at the different cartridges and what they did and all this stuff. If I go get my Sierra loading manual from when I was 12 years old, and I go buy a Sierra loading manual today, and I open it up to a given cartridge, 257 Weatherby, and I look at the powder charge when I was 12 and the powder charge today, it's different. It's the same powder, but it's a different charge because powder technology is advancing so much. And so a lot of this old...
So wait, even the same powder is different?
Yep.
But it's the same powder.
Yep.
But they probably, like you're saying, there are subtle changes
Yep.
in formulations over time. And
Oh, it's like the same.
Well,
like,
that's the process of making it has
Okay.
advanced.
Yeah.
So it's, I think everything's kind of improved.
Yep. And the same stuff still applies to like single base, double base, extruded ball, so on and so forth. Like that's all a descriptor to either a physical characteristic or a chemical characteristic to the powder. But touching on like that temperature sensitivity or like the pressure sensitivity, which Scott pointed out to me about a really popular powder that's super temp stable until under extreme pressure. And then it goes wildly temp unstable, which is really wild. That's fun. But a lot of that's kind of changing and very rapidly because a lot of the manufacturers are noticing like, hey, people really want easy to meter, accurate, consistent, and temp stable powder.
yeah.
And so we've got all this powder in our inventory here. It's names and numbers that people have trusted for decades and decades and decades. Like I know guys that are like, I only load BLC2 in my 223, period. Like I'll never put Vargid in there. And so that's a very trusted name. That guy will never change. How do we improve that particular powder to bring it up to speed for like modern capacities, right?
Yeah.
And so that's happening a lot lately too. So
That's, man, powder has got to be just an incredibly interesting
wild.
thing to work with.
yeah.
So, oh shoot, we just went off on so many things about powder. I forgot what I was going to ask next. But, is there ever a reason why somebody would go for a temp unstable powder? You said maybe you're getting more velocity or something
Yeah,
like
generally
that
you'll
out
get
of
more
it?
velocity.
But you just got to know what temperature you're going to be shooting at, right?
Right.
Be
And,
sure of it.
and ball powders are generally cheaper to buy. Not a whole lot cheaper,
Yeah.
honestly, but they're cheaper.
Okay.
But yeah, I would assume just velocity, honestly, or if
maybe even availability sometimes.
Availability,
would be a possible thing.
some people would probably argue if they're throwing from just a standard powder thrower that it meters better. I've never had that great of luck with ball powder throwing through a powder thrower that great personally.
Yeah, and it's counterintuitive because
Powder
you
thrower.
think like, oh, that stuff's going to meter. Like it doesn't though. It
Right,
sticks.
it just sticks to
yeah.
everything, and
Yeah.
like in
Between-
my experience, the best meter and powder out there is actually an extruded powder.
Yeah, which is super counterintuitive because you're trying to stuff sticks down a hole.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I get it.
So when
Yeah.
he's referring to metering, like how it flows through your measure or your dump, whether you want to call it a measure or dump or whatever, but like if you use a mechanical powder dump, like so many of them are, a little hopper on top, you pour your powder and you flick a
okay.
lever. That ball powder that's just a super fine granulate, you would think would just flow through there like water, but it's sticky and gets staticky.
And because they're so small, you get that static where they kind of stick to the plastic.
The extruded stuff, the first time I saw extruded powder is really weird.
Yeah.
Because I always just assumed that gunpowder was just like sand.
Yep.
But then you look at that stuff, and like you said, it's like stuffing sticks.
Yep.
It's like little like grains of rice or something almost down there. And it's strange to think that they even fit in properly.
Yeah, very counterintuitive.
Now, larger extruded powders don't meter worth a darn.
Right.
But generally just the kind of faster burning. Anything larger
than Varget.
Varget doesn't even do that great.
How do you determine what size powder you're going to be using? So I'd imagine that the faster burning stuff is smaller because there's more surface area to essentially light up.
Generally.
Right? So why would you want a slower burning big powder?
There's a number of reasons or a number of thoughts behind that, I guess you could say, right? There's definitely the argument of if you're using a slower burning powder, you're going to get more barrel life because it's not burning as hot. You can get those same velocities with a little less pressure, that type of thing. Obviously, there's a lot more that could go along with that statement there. But
would you tend to agree that smaller cases with heavy bullets and bigger cases with big bullets benefit from a slow burning powder?
Generally.
Yeah, yep. So I'm like focusing on 6.5 Creedmoor, 6.5 47, stuff like that, where you're shooting a pretty heavyweight bullet in a pretty small case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Where I wouldn't use the same application for the same case with a 30 caliber bullet. I might do something a little bit differently, like going from a 140 and a 6.5 Creedmoor loading, say IMR 4350, or H4350, and then going over to a 308 and then loading Varget or 8208.
Right.
Pretty different burn rate. Same case, more or less, but small case, heavy bullet for caliber, or big case like my 300 Weatherby or a Lazzaroni cartridge or something like that, shooting a big pill. I'd be shooting a slower burning, like a Magnum quote powder.
Yeah. This kind of thing is the stuff, I struggled with that when I was starting out too, trying to figure out what sort of powder to run. And that it's one place where I think talking to people with experience that have been out there and done it, and then reading, as I mentioned earlier, just spending time reading in some of the shooting forums. And, I think it's a pretty standard rule. Don't copy someone's load that you see out there somewhere and assume it's going to shoot well in your rifle.
Yeah.
That's not a good idea. But I think if you spend a lot of time reading some of these forums and talking to people, eventually you kind of see patterns come out, and you might see for a given cartridge and approximate bullet weight that you keep seeing the name of this powder come up again and again and again and again. And so, that gives you a pretty good starting point. You can be fairly sure that's probably a decent choice for what you're doing. So you can kind of, begin and narrow down and pick a powder based on something like that. And then you kind of get into that process of developing a load and picking a proper charge to run and experimenting with that.
Yeah.
But at least it'll help you kind of sift through that, initially wading into it and seeing, dozens of these powders out there, and, what do you pick? How do you start out?
Right.
It gives you a place to begin.
And so, Scott, you said you've kind of narrowed it down to the point where you're pretty much, as far as for rifle calibers, you're similar powders, if not the same powder across the board, kind of, right? Because you've tried them, you've found that at least for the cartridges you're loading, they work well. They don't have these spikes, things like that.
Yeah, pretty much. I'd say I probably have 5 different powders, and I can load everything that I own with.
How many different calibers do you shoot?
Different calibers or different rounds?
Ooh. Great question. Explain. I don't get it. Different calibers or different rounds? So are you talking about...
rounds or cartridge. And
okay.
then caliber obviously would just be...
yeah,
true.
Okay, all right, that's right. All right, great terminology. Time out there. A caliber is like 22 caliber,
size,
30 caliber, right? Stuff like that.
Right.
Where there can be a lot of different rounds within that caliber.
Right.
Or like a 308 and what's something else? It's a similar caliber to
30-06,
many things.
300.
Yeah, exactly.
Are all 30 cals.
Right. exactly.
How many different rounds you shoot then? Or
So let's see. So I own 6 Creedmoors. I don't believe I have any 6.5 Creedmoors right now.
You
okay,
know where the door is.
Get 'em off.
He's already gotten rid of that one.
this
That's
one.
old news.
Yeah.
MC Ryan.
It's too mainstream.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, and it's only because I've shot 6.5 47 for many years. So 6.5 47, 6 Creedmoor, 308, 223.
Do you have a 22 Creedmoor?
I do not. I've got a 338 Lapua.
So you get, but you
That's really it, though.
you've got a pretty big assortment though, and so you've kind of narrowed it down to a pretty general range of powders that you tend to use. And so
Yep.
that's part of what goes into how you might be able to, say you switch to something that at least is relatively similar to some of the stuff you've been shooting. You're able to sort of know a benchmark
Absolutely.
because you kind of understand what are some of these things like pressure curves and stuff like that. What else kind of goes into it aside from the powder they're using? Like just I guess you said bullet weight was one. Does the firearm itself and like how it like its action or anything like that ever come into play or
No, not. I mean, at least not for me. Most of the stuff I'm loading for is bolt action. So it's. I have to backtrack. I do have a 6.5 Creedmoor gas gun. Anyways,
there we
sorry.
okay, you can stay. This can still air.
But yeah, so I mean, typically I'm not necessarily shooting the heaviest bullet. I'm gonna look for the most efficient bullet, but also I want to shoot the most efficient bullet, but I don't want to give up consistency and just reliability across the board. I'd much rather have a gun that I know is going to shoot with very little maintenance, or a load that's going to shoot with very little maintenance, than to have another 10 or 20 points ballistic coefficient on a bullet. I'd rather give that up to know that this gun's going to shoot, even if I have to go, if I have to shoot 500 rounds over the next couple of weeks through it.
Nothing's really going to change.
Nothing's going to change.
Right.
Okay, that's interesting because I always thought
Pretty
like
desirable.
I always thought something like BC correlated directly to consistency. Like if you had a higher BC, you just magically get this more consistent.
No, I'd say that's definitely not true.
Yeah.
I mean that's.
I think it's a perception that people see a BC rating on a bullet and they automatically assume it is the best.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
like
very
it's literally
true.
just
Yeah.
a race to get the
Yeah.
highest number.
And like a big part of it is people be like, yeah, but what's the BC on that pill?
Right.
And that's fine. That's really great. But to have those high numbers. But if we look at like how a bullet is shaped, I think you could make an argument to the higher the BC, the slipperier the bullet is, the less forgiving it's going to be to load.
Really?
It could do with bearing
A lot of
surface.
times.
Yeah, could do with bearing surface, nose profile, whether it fits in your magazine,
Right.
how your chamber needs to be cut. And in this perpetual race for the giant number, there's a lot of afterthought that seems to be skipped by a lot of people when they buy a box of bullets or loaded ammo. It's like, will this fit in my magazine? But it's got a big BC number.
So just changing the beat, like what
So you gotta single feed
characteristics? What characteristics about the bullet would make it hard? That has a higher BC would make it hard to fit in your magazine. Like what's an example?
I'll jump on that quick,
Yeah.
and Ryan will chip in. To get a higher BC, usually what's going to happen? It's going to be a longer bullet.
Okay,
It's going to have more
okay.
length to it because it's typically a heavy for caliber bullet.
So it might run into the front of your magazine.
Exactly.
You won't be able to actually
You'll have
go down inside.
on your particular rifle, you'll have a limitation in how long that cartridge can be to actually fit in the magazines or to feed properly through it. And if it's too long, it just doesn't fit in there, or it won't feed, and the tips bind up or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So there's a limit to how far you can go with that. And then so what you can do is, you can jam those bullets deeper down in the brass, but that may not be the most. Getting back to where Scott was going,
Efficient.
looking for that efficiency, that predictability, that may not be the best place that bullet likes to sit in that cartridge in getting into the chambering on your rifle. It may not just be a good place to run. So that bullet doesn't end up being the best choice for you.
Oh, interesting.
And it kind of comes back to that length and the placement. And Scott, you can talk a little bit about jump
Right.
and jam and that sort of thing, and how that chamber is cut to work with bullets. There's a lot of puzzle parts that all fit together in that.
Yeah.
It's like Ryan said, just going into the store picking out a box of bullets because it has a BC number that's a little higher than the brand next to it. That may not work.
Might not.
Yeah.
It may and it may not. Right?
It might.
Right.
Yeah. You never. I mean,
might
it's,
or might not. But yeah, to add on to what Paul's saying, typically a higher BC bullet's going to have a longer ogive, a shorter bearing surface, and some sort of boat tail that generally is going to be fairly long itself, with the exception of some bullets. Hornady actually runs some fairly short boat tails on a lot of their bullets, which is interesting. And I think I know their reasons for it. We'll have to ask them sometime. But so generally speaking, if you have a long ogive or a long tip,
Okay.
and then you have this bearing surface that is
actually-
literally maybe a third of the length of that
And that actually mates up with the
rifling.
with the case.
the neck of the case.
Well, not only
Right.
that, but that's what mates up. That's what's actually touching your barrel when it's
Oh,
going
that's
down the
that's
bore.
getting spun.
Okay.
Right. So you have, say you have 30% of this whole front length if you're counting the bearing surface and the nose, and only 30% of that length is actually riding on the barrel. You've got all this weight spinning at whatever 300,000 RPMs, depending on what twist rate you're running, right?
Yeah.
To try to get stabilized.
Oh.
So so typically speaking, a shorter bearing surface bullet is going to be harder to keep in tune.
Yeah.
Because they either like to be jammed a certain amount or jumped a certain amount, and they like to be pretty close to that spot.
Jammed or jumped.
Right.
Jammed
So,
into the case or jumped
Ja-
out of it.
no, jammed into the lands
Oh,
of the
I
barrel,
see.
or jumping to the lands of the barrel.
Jumping to the lands.
Most jumping's, if you're hunting or shooting competition, you typically don't want to jam because, especially in a hunting situation,
Right, exactly.
you don't want, because what
If
can
you
happen?
if you
Why are
had
they
to
called jam and jump?
Literally,
well, it's pretty
Physically,
intuitive. If you
yeah.
So
think
like when
about
you're
it,
talking about when you actually chamber.
Thank you, Scott.
When you chamber the round
Now I get it.
into the gun.
Yep.
Yep.
the bullet nose, the ogive, that curved part,
Yeah.
stabs the
pushes
rifling.
right into the rifle. And the reason in a hunting,
That's a jam.
That's
Yeah.
a jam.
A jump is where it's just kind of like it's just
it's got a gap. that
Oh,
it
it's
has
got some
before it
room.
It's got
hits,
to
yeah.
jump before it gets there.
Yeah.
It gets a
And a-
heading.
And
Oh.
a jam
Gets a
is-
running start.
Oh, I get okay.
A
Yeah.
jam is bad for hunting because if you chambered a round that jammed into the lands, and then you ended up maybe at the end of the day or whenever you were getting back in a vehicle and you had to unchamber that round, what can happen is if it's jammed into those lands tightly enough, they'll
Might
grab the bullet. You go to eject it and you pull the case right off the back of the bullet,
Yep.
It's just
and
stuck
you got
in
a
there.
bullet jammed into the
And a pile of powder.
powder
inside
everywhere.
your gun.
Big mess. Yeah.
I was going to ask about that earlier when you were talking about, like when you're seating that bullet and having it be a little bit looser, and like why I generally don't worry about that. And what popped into my head is a buddy of mine, his wife's father had reloaded, these bullets. She was going on, I think, her first deer hunt, and he wanted to reload these bullets for her, and it was like this really special thing. And I don't know the whole. I think she shot and maybe missed or whatever. Anyway, she loaded
Something.
one, went to eject the shell, and she had
Big mess.
the bullet stayed in
Yeah.
the barrel, and nothing
We-
else did. And then they had a whole situation on their hands. So
And
No,
then if you don't have a way to get the bullet out of there, you're even, because you can during clean the powder, but if you don't have a cleaning rod and the bullet's really jammed,
Yeah.
there's just no
You're
way
done.
to get it out.
Yep.
Hey. Okay. So in that case, then that's it. Kind of makes sense now why you're saying maybe you would trade a little BC to get a little bit more bearing surface. Does that help then with your consistency?
Well,
Or am I just totally?
No, you're
compartmentalizing.
you're
I'm
not.
sure.
No, you're definitely not wrong, or maybe compartmentalizing a little bit.
Yeah, because you can't just like make the bearing size surface bigger and everything's better, right?
And it's not always better. So there's more that goes into it, right? So if you have a long bearing surface but still have a secant ogive, and now we're going to get into something else here.
Perfect. This is where we like to be.
So you have two different style of bullet tips. There's a secant ogive and tangent ogives.
Okay.
Right. So obviously, I guess, what would you call them, math majors or geometry majors out there would know right off. That's pretty self-explanatory what those mean.
Rocket scientists.
Okay.
So obviously, so a tangent ogive is a tangential. So it's running the bullet nose is basically consistently curving at a certain caliber
Okay.
radius, I think.
Sort of the rate of the curve change on the nose of that bullet. But I'll let Scott
Right.
So on a
continue with
tangent, when
his.
it doesn't change,
On
it's
a
just
tangent,
the rate of curve is the same. all
It
the way.
does, but it's a much higher caliber. So and it actually what's the term I'm looking here for, Ryan? It instead of
I went to public school and drank.
So a secant ogive is a much more abrupt tip.
Oh, okay.
So it's basically, instead of a radius, it's an actual just
Point.
angle cut, just going.
One
With
could,
that little is that little FN cartridge a secant? This is the first
so the
thing
bullet,
that popped in my head.
The bullet design, yes. So looking like if we're going to apply the cartoon diagram here, if you were to look at a 180 grain soft point
Okay.
for a for a hunting bullet in 30 caliber versus a 212 grain Hornady ELDX, this would be an example of a tangent and a secant ogive. The tangent could be considered an older bullet design, probably. Secant, a more modern.
Okay.
Kinda.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because when you get Spitzers in the mix there, it's
Right.
tricky. But yeah.
And then
Okay.
you can also have hybrids, which are a combination.
What were we getting? So what does this all come down to again? People can Google it. I thought
this was the
listeners. Google this. What is it? What does it get at? That what does it change
Okay.
or do?
So the more aggressive style tip you have,
Yeah.
typically the more difficult it's going to be to develop your load, and less consistent, generally speaking, right? So if you have, let's talk about a bullet that probably everybody here is mostly familiar with, the 175 Sierra Match King.
Okay.
I mean, kind of the go-to bullet for 308. If your gun doesn't shoot that bullet, something's wrong,
Hanging on.
right? And that's a tangent ogive. It's a very non-aggressive design tip and then the bullet itself has a fairly long bearing surface, makes the bullet a great bullet across the board for many different powders, many different guns. Very easy to develop a load for.
At about any velocity.
There you go, YouTube. That guy.
That's
Right.
the bullet.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah. It looks like if anybody ever drew a cartoon
Bullet.
of like a projectile bullet, it would probably look similar to that. Minus the boat tail. I think a lot of people don't know about boat tails.
Yeah, maybe.
But anyway.
So to my point is, if you have, the less aggressive the tip, generally speaking again, the
Yeah.
less aggressive the tip, the longer the bearing surface, the easier it is to get the load. to shoot.
Yeah, you can see that there. It's
Right.
definitely got a nice
long
bearing surface. It's got pretty non-aggressive
Yeah.
tip.
probably moderate BC. This would probably be a good example of what you're talking about when you're saying, hey, I'm willing to give up, that high BC number.
Absolutely.
Kind of like that perfect blend of attributes to get optimal consistency.
Right.
Like this, like you're talking about, this seems like a very forgiving setup or, option that a person could go with.
Now, on the other hand, now I'm looking up the ELDX. Is that an example of something that's not so
Well-
much the case? I just literally clicked on a random one.
So
this
Hornady does something pretty interesting. Is they typically have a very long bearing surface,
Yeah, that's what I noticed. Is it's
So
actually
they get away with having seek and O drives, in a way that a lot of other companies don't, because they have a longer bearing surface to make up for that aggressive tip.
which again just helps the rifling contact this and stabilize
Yeah.
it better. And
I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example. You know, imagine if you have a piece, you know, a foot long piece of pipe that's, you know, 2 inches diameter, and then you take an inch long piece of pipe that'll just barely fit inside that piece of pipe. And it has a little bit of play. It's harder to get it to go. It's going to want to catch before it slides down that piece of pipe, right? If it's just like an inch long. Whereas if you took a 6-inch long piece of pipe and then ran it into that 12-inch long piece of pipe, it's going to slide in and out of there very easily. It's got more stability, right? Does that make sense? So it's the same. It's basically the same thing. I know it's like a very horrible.
here's a bullet with a relatively short bearing
Yeah,
surface.
the VLDs.
Yeah. So that's the 95 grain VLD burger. Exactly. Super short bearing surface.
And
Another one
that's
would
a
be
pretty example of what you were talking about. It's
I
got
bet
a bullet
that's a
that has
slippery-
high numbers, but
Yeah.
it's more
Exactly.
finicky to
If you've tuned it, do you ever tune a rifle around a particular cartridge
absolutely
rather than the other way around?
around a bullet.
Yeah.
Or around a
Yep.
bullet. So maybe you've decided I want to use this bullet. I understand the fact that maybe this whatever is a little bit more finicky, but I'm going to build the rifle essentially around so that it can accommodate that.
And honestly, typically that's how I start every time.
Oh,
is-
really? Okay.
is there's a bullet I want to shoot.
I'm the opposite. Like, that gun looks cool. I hope I can find ammo for it.
And if you reload, you can.
True.
Yeah.
True.
yeah.
I do the same from a hunting perspective too. I think so. Scott and I would have a different approach to this from an advanced reloader's perspective, and I'm nowhere near as advanced as Scotty. So, like, here's a very specific. For instance, you and I were hunting yesterday. I had my little Kimber there, right? My little 308.
Yeah.
I'm going to shorten that barrel up a little bit more, and so it's going to be a pretty short gun. And a lot of people are gonna be like, "Man, you're going to lose a lot of velocity." I'm going to shoot exclusively a 130 grain 30 caliber projectile out of that because I can drive it at a pretty high velocity, negate the loss of BC,
Sure.
and within the what I'll consider my usable ethical range that I'll shoot a game animal with that gun, I'll have the best of both worlds for muzzle velocity, energy, bullet type, which is for me a lot of times more important than anything else. And then I get this super handy little lightweight packable rifle.
What came first, though? You wanted to do the rifle first, then you decided that you'd make a
I wanted
round work for it.
to do the projectile first.
You wanted to use a 130 grain 30 caliber bullet first,
With the-
and then you decided that
Concept
that would allow you to have a shorter rifle.
correct. A super small, lightweight little.
Why would you want to? So why? What's the point of going to that 130 grain? Like, was it just because? What kind of? Is it like a really accurate bullet, or is it?
I've
like,
had really
what is
good
it?
luck with it. Yeah,
Okay.
in the past, I've loaded that particular bullet in I think every 30 caliber cartridge I've ever owned, with the exception of a Lazzaroni, which I never fired. I wanted this really lightweight gun. I wanted it in that caliber. I wanted it in that size, and I knew that if I had the barrel as short as I planned on going with it, it would be like a huge suffering of velocity. Like if I were to shoot a 178 grain bullet or 175, the numbers would be absolutely anemic.
Okay.
And not that that's a bad thing, because the distances realistically I'm willing to hunt with it, probably not going to hurt anything. But I did want a cartridge that was, a bullet that was going to allow me to drive it a little bit faster. And help negate kind of the side effects of loss of velocity.
So what? Are you just going to chop that barrel down and then that's it, or are you going to put a new barrel on it?
Nope,
Because
chop it down.
You're going to chop it. Okay, so what do you do then with, like, you've got a twist rate in that barrel, which now has been, you haven't made it any more
Nope,
dramatic.
that
even though
won't
you shortened
change.
the barrel.
It's just going to be, so like the biggest observable loss will hopefully it's not anything catastrophic, but hopefully will be velocity. So you can either load the cartridge way stouter, get into that potential dangerous scenario. You lose efficiency by doing that, right? We're trying to stuff a bunch of powder into a case underneath a bullet of the same weight. I'm upping recoil, blah, blah, blah. Or I step down in bullet weight, up in velocity, kind of get back to where the cartridge normally would be with a given weight prior to the barrel chop. But I'm also changing the bullet design too, and that part's a really, really big part of this. So I'm going from a cup and core style bullet to a homogeneous bullet, a solid copper bullet. That 130 grain bullet is very similar to a lot of 150 to 165 grain bullets in length and aspect and all that stuff, and it's going to perform a lot better out of that little gun.
Well, and with the fast powders you're going to use, you probably won't see that much muzzle velocity loss.
No, and I would, yeah.
You know, that's one thing. So with slower burning powders, you know, the muzzle velocity thing is more apparent with the longer barrel you get or the shorter barrel you get. With faster burning powders, they're able to actually fully burn in a shorter barrel.
So the bullet gets all of its oomph.
Right. You typically don't. You're still going to lose some velocity, but not to the extent that you would, let's say, you know, cutting down a 30-inch 338 Lapua down to 20 inches. Right.
Yeah.
You're going to lose quite a bit of velocity.
I see.
Whereas if you take a 24-inch 308 and cut it down to 16 inches, and then also on top of that go down to 130 grain bullet, you can then run even faster powder, say 4198 or 8208, which is what I would pick personally.
That's what I'm doing.
You're probably not going to lose all that much.
Which is exactly what Scott just said, the 308. That's pretty much exactly what's happening.
Very cool.
I've got two things.
Go for it.
Number one, I think you've been talking to Dave because I know the rifle that you're talking about, and it is already
I think we're back to that ounce counting thing again.
Yeah.
It's already an ultralight, super handy rifle.
Yeah.
I made it out there just fine with like a 12-pound Russian Vepr, and we hiked a lot.
We did.
I've hunted. You lent me that rifle for a hunt.
Yeah.
On probably the most extreme quote backpack hunt that I've been on. It was amazing. It was perfect for the application.
There was more to be had there.
Okay.
And advanced reloading practices are going to get me there.
We're dropping like flies, Vortex Nation.
Okay.
We're dropping like flies. Dave first, now Ryan. Who's next?
It's not like that.
Question two.
Question 2, go ahead.
There's been a lot of numbers thrown around here,
Yeah.
a variety of numbers, but when you guys are talking about these specific powders, different powders,
It's 8208 or whatever, something.
you know, and it's almost like I'm total neophyte when it comes to reloading. So this is like the same, I guess, when a person says, well, what's a 10x42 binocular? You're like, oh, well, I'll tell you what those numbers mean. Are these SKUs, or is there something these
we'll call it a
numbers?
SKU.
Model number.
Yeah.
So it's just a model number. I didn't know if there was
General.
like it was describing an attribute of it at all.
They couldn't call it like, Scorpion or like.
There's a couple companies
There
that
are
do have some
some
names.
fun names. Yeah.
Tac.
Yep. Ramshot, Magnum, Tac.
Because right now it's just kind of like a bunch of German cars.
Retumbo, where
Oh,
did that
the-
name come from?
Yeah, I
That's
don't
another
know.
one. It's like
Yeah,
an African elephant or something. Yeah.
Right. And Retumbo you put in big guns.
Like in my
Yeah.
338 Lapua. that's
Retumbo,
what I wanted,
yeah. It sounds like a big drum. The Retumbo.
Sounds of the Retumbo.
Yeah. So
It's like a CD you listen to when you're going to bed.
they are just a name. It gets super confusing too, and this is probably something to go back to the Reloading 101 podcast when you're identifying powders. So there's a couple of big main powder companies, and then they've got these numbers for it. Some of their numbers correlate, and some of them have zero correlation. H4350, IMR 4350. These are not interchangeable powders. You cannot do the same thing. They do not do the same thing. Well, you could do the same thing with them.
They're similar,
don't-
but you don't want to interchange them without testing.
They don't do the same thing.
Noted.
In other words, don't duplicate your load with
Right.
one
Exactly.
right to the other.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Noted.
And same thing with H4198, IMR 4198. The data doesn't swap. And each one of them has a strong point, and each one of them could arguably have a weak point too. 8208 comes in a very brightly colored golden can, and it's like one of the finest powders ever made for about everything. I've loaded 8208 and 375 H&H and 223 and all sorts of other stuff.
How's the temp stability on that?
Very good.
Is it
Probably the best.
Yeah, super good powder.
Well, it sounds like the packaging is quite attractive.
Yeah, it is. It's gold. I mean, it's just it's good.
Shooting pure gold.
Yep.
Which, by the way, when I am loading 223, I actually throw 8208 out of a powder hopper. I don't even use my expensive
Prometheus.
powder measure.
Prometheus. I heard about the Prometheus.
Yeah,
We discussed that it might even be something for a whole nother podcast.
it could be. I could get the.
It's so
we could fly up the designer.
It's so incredibly amazing that you can't even buy it. Like you can't even That's what Ryan said.
They're still on a rental thing, right? Or
Yeah,
like
he
a
has
quote
it where
lease?
you can own it outright now, though.
Okay.
Oh,
All
okay.
right. It's changed it a little
I
bit.
think it charges a little more, but
Okay.
I was thinking that soon we were going to start hearing Prometheus jokes like Chuck Norris jokes.
And you could.
The Prometheus is so precise that it doesn't bring your bullet to the target; it brings your target to you, so you can punch it in the face instead, or something.
the Prometheus definitely could deserve its own podcast. It's a whole nother.
Chuck Norris invented the
So-
Prometheus.
Yeah, that's right.
It's the Prometheus Gen 2. If anybody wants to Google it.
Check it out. It's crazy from what I've heard. So talking about we talked quite a bit about projectiles and bullets. The selection thing is still interesting to me. You know, when people talk about Ryan, you just talked about you're looking at doing this 130 grain bullet. You're going to be shooting that exclusively.
The golden powder.
Yeah, and I'd have to imagine that there's a lot of. I know that there's a lot of bullets out there, and I'd have to imagine that just about every bullet has the potential to shoot well out of something.
Mhm.
But you kind of have to figure out what that like. Do you ever do? Have you ever done testing where you'll get 20 of one bullet, 20 of another bullet, 20 of another, or something like that? Then you'll just shoot them and see what happens out of your particular rifle, or do you kind of have? Are there characteristics? And maybe it's just being repetitive because maybe it's stuff like bearing surface and ogive and stuff like that. But
Yes.
or weights,
Yeah.
things like that, you
Mhm.
know? How do you determine what weight? Why is it that there's 140 grain Hornady 6.5 Creedmoor and then there's 143 grain Hornady 6.5
Different
Creedmoor?
bullet design in that particular instance. So the ELD bullet in the 140 is they gear it towards match specific, right?
There's a thinner jacket on that one.
The 143, the ELDX, actually, if you were to cross section that bullet, it has a mechanical bond that runs into the core
Okay.
that helps hold it together.
For
Shooting game.
okay.
So it's a heavier constructed bullet.
Yep.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, yes, and usually it'd be like if I got a weird rifle, which I did the other day, and I'm throwing a dart at a board as to what's going to shoot in it because of its unknown to me chamber dimensions and behavior. So I had a 280 Ackley built, and the reamer that was used to cut the chamber was not actually the reamer that it was supposed to be. So the chamber is cut for 280 Ackley, but using a VLD profile bullet, which I don't shoot. So now I went to my local sporting goods store and bought a myriad of bullets of a particular kind of construction that I wanted. And I will be loading them to find out which one will shoot the best. And then I'll be happy with that bullet because that's all I can do in that gun until I burn the barrel out or decide it bothers me too much.
So a lot of it runs down to your rifle too.
Yeah, correct. And so in that instance, I'm just going to grab a whole bunch of stuff and start playing with it until I find one that shoots.
When you get a factory rifle, is it kind of cut to accept a lot of different kinds of bullets? Whereas when you do a custom rifle, like you said, it sounds like it was cut for a very, very specific type of bullet.
Yeah. So the factory guns, I think nowadays, are probably set up more for factory ammunition. Like a lot of these gun companies are either partnering with a particular ammunition company or they're trying to build a chamber dimension that's going to work with a broad swath of projectile styles and reasonable weights within that particular cartridge loading, right?
Like the Three Bears.
Yeah.
Well,
correct.
generally,
Not too hot, not too cold, right in the middle.
Well, generally, factory chambers are going to be cut to SAMI specs.
Sammy.
Which is kind of the regulating board over was it Sporting Arms
And manufacturing.
and Manufacturing
Institution.
Institute or something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So naturally, the ammo manufacturers are going to make their ammo to fit that, and the gun manufacturers are going to cut their chambers to work with those specs.
Right.
Now, does that mean that everybody's ammo is going to shoot in that gun? No, absolutely not, because there's a myriad of different bullet choices available. But it does mean they're all going to fit in there.
Okay.
You know, whereas like if you have an instance with a custom gun, let's say, you know, we make a 243 with basically no throat. So basically just got the roll of the reamer coming off the edge of the neck of the case and essentially no throat cut, which a lot of varmint guns, a lot of, you know, lightweight, you know, 60 grain, 50 grain, even whatever the smallest 6mm bullet is out there, where these guys are, you know, wanting to get as close to 4,000 feet per second or more that they can. That's how they'll cut those chambers, because those bullets don't. There's, you know, they need to get the lands as close as they can, otherwise they're jumping a mile.
Gotcha.
So if we went and bought factory ammo with a heavier bullet and tried putting it in that chamber, a couple things are going to happen. It may go depending on the bullet design, but you're going to be jamming the crap out of the bullet.
Oh, I see. Because
You might even
heavier,
push
bigger.
it down into the case. It's going to be so bad because there's literally not even an angle cut for the throat.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, so
Interesting stuff. Well, okay, I got a couple other things I want to knock out in this one. This has been, geez, there's a lot of stuff.
you could
It's
probably
hard
do
to realize.
10
You could probably just
episodes
do
of-
like infinity on bullets and ammunition, because there's so
Yeah.
many. But a couple things I want to ask. So we got a couple of listener questions on our last one that we did. Throw these guys out to you. Anybody can answer it. First one came in from a guy named BJ, and I think the last name is Key, Kea. And BJ wanted to know advanced reloading techniques, cover advanced topics like PFLS, partial full-length sizing. When would one need to apply such a technique? And then full-length sizing versus neck sizing, crimp or no crimp. What is any of that stuff?
I'll take a stab.
Yeah.
So personally, I would say always full length size. I mean, if you're a bench rest shooter, not shooting super hot loads, you can neck size if you'd like. The reason I full length size is, for one, I don't want an instance where my case I can't chamber around, basically, because I didn't full length size, and the last time I shot that one, maybe it was raining out and that case expanded a little more than normal.
So
This might be a
wait, yeah,
one-on-one,
so
but what is full length size?
Yeah, what
So
is that?
full length sizing is literally sizing the whole brass cartridge all the way down to the bottom of it.
Okay.
Oh,
Whereas
okay.
neck sizing is just sizing the neck, the part
Only
that
the
holds
neck.
onto the bullet.
Okay.
Right. So you'll get a lot of different answers from different guys on this. For the style of shooting that I do, I think, or for anybody shooting gas guns,
Oh, yeah. Good point.
you definitely want full length sizing.
And I'd say for hunting, in
And
many
honestly,
cases
I
too,
would
where you
say-
want the gun to always feed, no worries.
I feel like we've just described about every scenario. to where-
Honestly.
Yes and no. I mean,
I mean, it's still an opinion, but
yep. And I want Scott to finish his point because I've got a counter to it, because he and I have had this discussion in the past.
the other reason I like full length sizing, and I'll even go as far to say I actually prefer even small base sizing when if a die is available, which actually sizes the base of the case even
Like your
more.
extractor grabs onto and stuff, or
No, just the case head, the
okay.
webbing.
Okay.
You know,
Just forward to that.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Yeah.
so, and the reason for that is because when I chamber that round, I want it sitting in the chamber in the same spot every time.
Okay.
So if I don't full length size, or if I'm just sizing the case to where it just fits in the chamber, if something's not perfect in there, it could be, let's say I fired that case in that chamber previously, and it's a tenth of a thou out around the chamber, which is within anybody's specs, but it's still there, right? It's still a tolerance. And now I just neck size, or I've got a die that's not sizing all that well, and I chamber that cartridge. What are the chances that I'm actually chambering that cartridge in the same exact spot in that chamber again? Next to zero, right? So I want that case sitting in the same spot every time. Again, going back to that consistency thing.
Yeah.
So I highly recommend full length sizing.
Okay.
I think you run into issues if you just neck size. If you're not running, like I said, I think certain bench rest guys can get away with it. But
Just the neck sizing?
Yeah.
And what is the reason guys would just neck size? Is that maybe to reduce how much you're working the brass and get more life out of brass?
There's that, but there's also, they have in their mind that, and in some instances, I guess technically they could be correct, that they want that case fully supported and formed perfectly to that chamber, right?
Yeah.
But if we don't have a chamber that's perfect in the first place, how can we do that?
Makes sense.
You know what I mean?
And to counter that, though, like, unless you made your chamber and your die with the same reamer, your die couldn't even be close to that, right? So they
Correct.
could have the same amount of theoretical run out. So my counter to the full length size, and I'm gonna back up here a little bit. I full length sized everything with the exception of a few things, or to Scott's point, small base size, a lot of stuff, like 223 in a gas gun. But for a very specific 25-06 Ackley, 280 Ackley, 257 Weatherby, and 300 Weatherby. 4 cartridges that I have loaded or currently load for. The Ackley cases, starting with non-Ackley cases, fire forming them in an Ackley chamber to blow out their dimension. I saw that I got notably better accuracy and velocity with and notably, I guess is a pretty subjective term, but I got better accuracy and velocity with a neck-sized only case as opposed to a full-length only or full-length sized case. Same thing with the Weatherbys, and actually more so with the Weatherbys and the Ackleys. With my 300 Weatherby, for instance, I fire formed a whole bunch of brass and then full-length sized it and then neck sized a lot. And the two were different to the point that I told myself I'm definitely going to just neck size.
Sure. And there could be some variables there, right?
Yeah.
It could be that your full length sizing dies may have an issue,
Could be.
right?
Yep.
There's a number of things that could
Basically,
go on
it's
there.
probably you.
Probably. I think in Scott's very polite way, he's saying like,
What's
nah, buddy.
But and that's the thing. That's why I say all of this is opinion, because you can find for the same amount of guys that you can find that'll say that'll fight you tooth and nail to argue neck sizing. You can find that same amount of guys that say my gun never shoots better than when I'm shooting virgin brass in it.
Yeah.
You know,
Interesting.
like I said, it's all opinions and honestly, a lot of it it's like kind of just what works for you, and I think anybody that's reloading is going to experiment and they're going to figure out it's just in that type of person's nature. I mean, if you're reloading, you're kind of a tinkerer,
Yeah. Is it pretty much
generally speaking?
Is
I'm
it
sure
pretty
there's
much the same story for when he says crimp versus no crimp?
So, crimping, I don't really crimp anything. You definitely could, maybe should in some instances, like on gas guns, to where, when a round's being violently chambered and the tip can be hitting stuff as it's going in to the chamber, you don't want the bullet getting seated farther down into the case.
What does crimping do then?
Crimping is exactly what it sounds like. It actually crimps the bullet. So you crimp
The edge of the
case.
mouth of the.
So,
Right.
okay, up at the top of the neck or the case.
Right.
it
Now,
crimps
typically,
it,
if you're
kinda
going to be
grabs.
crimping with rifle cartridges, you want a bullet with a cannular.
Cantaloupe?
Another word.
Cantaloupe? Like a cantaloupe, but a cantaloupe?
Pretty
Exactly.
much, yeah.
Okay.
It's a groove that's been,
Basically a groove that's kind of
yeah.
Oh, okay.
cut in the bullet. It's not cut, it's formed in the bullet. But
Yeah. Okay.
Handgun ammo, you crimp, but there's no, well, sometimes there's cantaloupe. Usually not, though.
Yep. Defensive bullets or a heavy hunting bullet.
Yeah.
Big cartridges like 44 mag. Yep.
Right.
Okay.
Again, because, we're talking semi-autos,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of kind of, recoil inertia, so to speak, that can, if you don't have enough neck tension on the bullet, the bullets can move around.
Stuff can get pretty Western.
Right. So.
Yep.
Okay. And then another one we got, this is Rifle this guy, he is from Norway, so I'm probably going to mess this up. Rifle Jigaren? We'll go with
Let's
it.
go with it. Yep.
Sounds good.
Okay, he says about the reloading workroom. Now, Scott mentioned that his looks like a trailer park tornado scene, so I don't know. But he says, do you have any recommendations on temperature and air moisture levels? Dry, moist, hot, or cold? He was curious if that has any effect or if it's something you need to pay attention to when you're reloading.
I'll tell you, I don't think it necessarily has a real effect as long as you have your powder closed. That being said,
Powder shouldn't get wet.
yeah, a good rule of thumb is treat your reloading stuff like vegetables, right? Like potatoes, I guess would be a good one.
So
This is
good.
fascinating. I
Chop 'em
know
up.
where you're going with this.
Insider
Though.
As far
information.
Chop 'em up,
cool,
fry 'em,
cool, dry,
salt, pepper.
just cool, dry area.
Okay.
That way, there's no room for contaminants and it'll last longer,
Cool,
right?
dry area.
So just
All right.
like potatoes or
I like that.
melons, squash.
Yep.
Good to know.
for
Perfect.
those gardeners out there.
Perfect. Okay, last thing too was as far as cases go. We've talked a lot about powders and projectiles. Do cases play a big role in accuracy or things like that?
This is an off-debated topic. Is that cartridge inherently accurate?
There definitely seems to be certain cartridges that are more inherently accurate than others. Whether anybody's actually gotten good, solid data, like scientific proof on that, I don't even know how you would, honestly.
Without imparting a bias just due to the number of people shooting it.
Right.
If we look back historically speaking, the Wimbledon Cup was won with a 300 H&H for many years. And a lot of people would look at that case and be like, that sucker ain't going to shoot because it looks like a giant sprig of asparagus with a belt on it. Yeah. So, like, everything wrong with it, right? Whereas people like 308, that shoots. I think, like, a lot of good rifles are built in 308 or 6.5 Creedmoor. But I've got an .6 that shoots into the, like, .3s, .4s.
223 is another one. 223, honestly, like if
That's something though where it's like it might be inherently more accurate because it's a super gentle cartridge to shoot.
Right.
So therefore, the person
there's that.
I mean,
there's that.
And that has to do, and so all these things that we're talking about have to do with the case?
Yeah, case design. Yeah.
Case design.
Yep. Then there's a lot of, like, let's look at the 300 H&H versus the 300 short mag. So they're ballistically about identical. The 300 short mag, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. Very short, squat little cartridge.
superior.
Yep. Well, Marco. Oh gosh. The 300 H&H, big, tall, long, slender, tapered with a belt. Very like British design. So 300 short mag, squat, square, like has all the modern amenities.
Modern,
and,
yeah,
everybody looks at
yeah.
it. That looks good. And then you look at a 300 H&H, you're like, that looks like a blimp. It just doesn't look like it would do anything for anybody. And so case design, if you're looking at a powder column that's short and wide, that's going to ignite probably, what was the word we'd use, more simultaneously, more
Evenly?
Yeah,
I don't know,
evenly.
but
Even
consistently.
versus
yeah,
this
yeah.
long powder column.
Yeah.
People have made that argument to me before. or having a belt on there, which is something that's not valid anymore. You don't need a belt on a cartridge. It's not providing us anything. We're not doing anything with it. A beltless versus a non-belted, a belted case is going to be more accurate or not. I guess it depends. Or even neck length. Like I've got a buddy of mine who's like, I won't shoot a 300 Win Mag because the neck is too short relative to the caliber of the bullet. And I don't know. I think 300 Win Mag's been pretty successful for a while.
Yeah, he'll probably neck size.
Right.
What? So
which,
what is
which
it?
will
What's the
eliminate
deal
a
with?
third of his neck.
Why does it seem? Why does it seem like a lot of these really precise cartridges, people are always like, "Oh, it's a blah 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 necked down to a blah blah blah." Why does it seem like they're always like, "Oh man, like that's what everybody's trying to go for"? Like as soon as you just take any cartridge and just neck it down, it's like all of a sudden magically better.
I think that
They usually get bigger velocity
I'd say
numbers when they're doing
that's-
that kind of thing.
I don't know. I mean,
Is it because they're shooting a smaller bullet with essentially the same
smaller diameter bullet.
with
Well,
essentially the
yeah.
same
so what if we look
case
at what if we look at it this way?
capacity? Yes, there
Like
is.
let's look at the spawning of the 6.5 Creedmoor as I would see it from
The prom king of cartridges,
to
as
quote
Ian
Ian, yeah.
Clem would say.
So from the 308 came the 260 in 1997, and it had a great success, but it did a couple of things that weren't quite right, depending on who you're talking to, right?
It was the rifles that weren't quite right.
Partially, yeah, they twisted them wrong, the factory stuff. And then the 6.5 Creedmoor came out of it because somebody saw a different case, slightly different case, similar dimensions. It was a 30 TC, and like you said, they necked it down. But it really is kind of the same principle as a 260, right? This class case necked down to 6.5 because it's a great bullet diameter. But somebody saw something or a shortcoming in an existing cartridge and realized that it would probably be better if we just made these little tweaks, did it, and it worked. So to your question, like, why is it always seeming like these wildcats are more accurate? Was that kind of what you meant?
Yeah, it just always seems like you neck it down, it's good. Take that, neck it down. It's good. Well, what happens when somebody necks down a 6.5 Creedmoor? You just neck down a neck down cartridge.
You're putting your neck on the line.
You're sticking your neck out there,
Right.
yeah.
You could bring it to the next level.
Then
And-
you have a 6 Creedmoor.
Then you have
right.
a 6 Creed.
Then
Or
you neck
twen-
that down, you got a
Yeah.
22 Creed.
I was gonna say, is that the 22 Creed?
I mean, the only reason anybody calls it neck down is because there's not a factory cartridge for it yet.
Oh,
That's
Doesn't
a
mean
good
there never
point.
will
Yeah,
be.
that's a
I mean,
good point.
like, because the 6 Creedmoor technically isn't a neck down 6.5 Creedmoor anymore because there's a
It's a
6
Creedmoor,
Creedmoor
right? Yeah.
Sammy spec.
Yeah.
okay, so necking down is like an engine swap.
Well, it's kind of more like the
hot rod-
reverse.
It's like hot
yeah.
rodding.
It's like the
hot
reverse of
rodding.
Yeah, okay.
reverse of a bore and stroke kit. Right?
Okay,
So we're actually going to make your piston smaller.
right.
Yeah.
So you can run higher RPMs and
Yep.
stuff.
Right.
Did they? Can you do
Yep,
that?
and
Can
burn
you
and burn your motor out quicker.
Yeah.
Or your barrel.
Can you
Exactly.
sleeve
That's
a
good
piston?
analogy.
Yeah.
make it smaller? Go from 350 to like a 340.
These
I'm
days,
not
if you
sure
wanna
that
do
would be commonly done, but
These
I'm
days,
sure
I mean,
it
if
could
you
be
wanted to
done.
do it, you can do it. Well, people sleeve, what am I trying to say? The blocks themselves. But
yeah.
that's in order to make the engine block inherently more strong.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah,
Or not inherently, because you made it inherently designed. Inherently, it was
Another
not
word.
as strong. You inherently made it stronger.
right.
Out-herringly. I'm not even saying the same. Out-herring.
Fishing.
No, we're talking
MC
fishing.
Ryan is like pointing at the timer right now, saying that we're all gonna go loopy if we podcast much longer.
I don't think it's even the time. He just wants to go at this point. He's heard
He
enough.
doesn't want to get going on herring.
They're talking,
Guys,
yeah,
I'm
they're talking
hungry.
about herring. I'm out of here.
I'm hungry, guys. Well, reloading 201 here. This has been pretty wild. I don't know if we want to do a quick round of last calls here. What do you guys say?
I've got
Go
it.
for it.
Yeah.
Let's do it. For my last call. Oh shoot! I think it was the case thing. My last call is that we could do a lot of these on
Yeah.
reloading. We have some ideas to do some podcasts on cartridges and things like that. Did I say that right? Cartridges? Yeah, not calibers. No, actually calibers. We're actually going to do some anyway. My brain's gone. Mark, you're up.
My last call is when it comes to reloading. I'm basically here for moral support, so hopefully I've provided that today.
I feel more comfortable.
A lot of cool stuff, man. Interesting stuff, like you said, Jim. I mean, it's like endless. And to Scott's point, if you're a tinkerer, this is probably something that's for you. And I think you could endlessly tinker and find new things. And
I think if we stumbled upon anything in 201, if anybody was looking for the definitive reloading answer, you just figured out that, yet again, like most things in life, the answer to reloading is it depends.
Well, it's just there's just 100 ways to skin a cat is what it comes down to. You know,
I would say for the person who is reloading and you want to go a step further, maybe you've got a goofy cartridge that you want to make goofier, or you've got a rifle that's giving you fits. To Scott's point earlier, there's not a lot of this in a manual. Most of this has been found through trial and error. There's probably a good community of people out there that have trialed and errored. Unless you have a rifle that you built in your basement that nobody's ever seen before, good chances somebody's had an opportunity to goof with it. Get online and start doing some investigations. Don't necessarily get frustrated when you find that it's difficult. Just do it. Just try it. Practice safety and you'll be okay. It's the same as starting and reloading. You're just starting a new chapter in reloading.
There you go.
Yeah.
so
I have one more real quick.
go ahead.
Fluorescent lights goof with digital powder scales. I'm just going to say that right now.
Sensitive ones, yeah.
Yeah. That's
What
all.
do they
Noted.
do?
I don't know what it is.
They change the
force.
accuracy of them, or just the
Just how
visibility?
they
Make 'em
fluctuate.
float. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Well,
interesting.
I'm going to tell you right now, I've spent some time under a tinfoil hat trying to figure out what was going on. And I noticed when I had an incandescent bulb, things were fine.
Your cartridge is shot better.
Yep.
Yeah,
Ryan
yeah.
comes into work and he just looks really just like burned out.
Yep.
And it's because he's been staring at lights all night.
Yeah.
Just
Correct.
lays on the table and looks up.
The incandescent lamp, everything's cool. Fluorescent bulb, not cool.
my big takeaway then is I'm going to keep my potatoes out of fluorescent light.
I think that's the answer.
Don't get discouraged with reloading, and don't be scared of it. As long as you don't put the wrong powder, or especially a pistol powder, in a rifle case, there's not a whole lot to be scared of. I mean, if you're running a correct powder for the case that you're loading for, you typically have to try pretty hard to have a catastrophic problem. Not saying that you can't, but you just have to be not paying attention or something. The other thing I would say is, if you're starting to get to the point of reloading where you're kind of getting that next level, and you're hearing people talking about annealing, and this is going to have to be a whole nother show probably. I would highly advise against annealing until you get extremely advanced. I personally believe that the majority of people out there actually make their cases more inconsistent and do exactly the opposite of what they're trying to do
After having spent a lot of money.
with annealing.
Yeah.
That being said, I mean, there is one particular device out there these days. I believe it's like $1,200 coming out of Australia or New Zealand. I think Australia. That I think, from everything I've heard, I have not used one, actually does a good job. That being said, I think annealing is extremely, this is just my opinion. There'll be people throwing stuff at the radio or their earphones right now, but but you really can mess with the consistency of your cases if you don't know exactly what you're doing with annealing. I can tell you, I personally only anneal at the very last minute. If my batch of brass that I've been using, if I developed a cracked neck, then okay, I'll go back and anneal because now my cases are pretty hard. Now somebody's probably thinking, well, yeah, but your cases are getting harder. How are you getting, how are you getting the neck tension, the consistency and the neck tension and all this stuff? Well, all my cases have been, as long as I'm keeping track of my cases and only firing them in one gun, they're consistently getting harder. So what I've seen over the years is that I can go, like, you know, with the brass that I run, typically a good 10 firings.
Wow.
And the things still shoot phenomenal. And a lot of times even more than that without annealing. So I would do, and until you are like really ready and just want to venture into annealing, I would work on other things first.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Nice.
I like it.
Good. I'll tag on to what Scott started with. I think it's something that if people are curious after listening to this, is dive in and try it. You don't have to sink a lot of money into a basic press setup to get going. I mean, that's how I did it. And, right along with that, I know for all the listeners here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're right in a great time of year to spend a little time behind a reloading bench. It's about the heart of winter, and it's not a bad activity on a nasty winter day. So
That is the truth.
yeah, I'll call that one good.
Excellent. Well, that sounds good to us. Everybody, as we've mentioned a few times here, there's lots of stuff revolving around reloading and cartridges and things like that. And it seems like a number of you are pretty interested in it. The Reloading 101 podcast went over pretty well, got a lot of listens and a lot of questions. So as always, feel free to hit us up, Instagram, social media, or anywhere else. Oh, man, Scott you made it all
Right
the way
at
to the
the
end.
end.
All the way to the end, and then you got the cell phone going off. But, yeah, hit us up with other questions. Maybe we can do more of these in the future. Who knows? 301, the Prometheus, whatever. We might talk about it, too.
Prometheus and annealing.
Hit us up. So, yeah, thanks, everybody. We're going to end this one on the old classic bye.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
All right, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Vortex Nation podcast. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hit that subscribe button so you can always stay up to date on the latest happenings over here at the Vortex Nation podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. Again, everybody, thanks, and happy hunting and shooting. We appreciate it. Have a good one.